Okay, we are live. Joining me today is an extra special guest, Dr. Keith Frankish. Keith, for those who don't know you, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes. Who am I? That's a question I've been asking myself a long time. Well, I'm trained as a philosopher of mind. I've worked for the Open University in the UK for a long time. Recent years, we relocated to Crete, and so I'm living in Greece and Crete at the moment. I work mainly on issues concerning the conscious mind. On the one hand, the nature of conscious belief and conscious reasoning, and on the other hand, unconscious experience. And I advocate a position which I call illusionism, which is a form of eliminativism about phenomenal consciousness. I think the notion of phenomenal consciousness is one that is probably confused and certainly unhelpful, and I don't think that phenomenal consciousness in the traditional philosophical sense exists. So that's something we will talk about. That's probably what I'm best known for at the moment. Yes, I'm interested in lots of things. I'm trying to sort of broaden out my interests as I get a little bit older, rather than narrowing them down, which happens all easily. Yes.
So can I? Obviously, I want to talk about the illusionism stuff, and I find that very interesting. But just before getting to that, before you were sort of working explicitly on illusionism, you were doing the dual processing kind of stuff, right? You wrote that book, Supermind, Mind and Supermind.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about if you think that earlier work led you to where you are with respect to consciousness, or how they relate, or do you think they're separate projects? Or
I think they're separate projects. I'd always had an interest in consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, and that sort of was always a kind of secondary stream to my interest. And I became particularly interested in actually working on it after writing a textbook for the Open University on consciousness, which forced me to really get into the literature and get my head around it all. It's a really good way of getting into a new field to write a textbook. And so after that, I started doing more research on phenomenal consciousness. The other strand, the strand thinking about the nature of belief and reasoning, that came out of thinking about folk psychology. When I was in graduate school, a long time ago now, it seems one of the big issues was the future of folk psychology. A lot of people thought that folk psychology, ordinary belief, desire psychology, was kind of doomed. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about this and reading the sort of literature that was around in the early 90s. And I came to the conclusion that really, when we talk about belief and desire and thinking and these kind of things, they're really two rather different sorts of phenomena. They're two different kinds of belief and two kinds of things we mean by reasoning. Which it wasn't just that there was non-conscious belief and conscious belief, where it was the same thing, that one was conscious and the other wasn't. It was that there were two quite different kinds of state. And when we speak of conscious belief, we're speaking of really a very different sort of attitude from non-conscious belief. The same with conscious reasoning. Conscious reasoning isn't just reasoning, that's non-conscious reasoning with the lights on. It's a different animal altogether. And so I tried to develop this into the sort of picture that I had in Mind and Supermind. And then I realized that a lot of psychologists were doing pretty much the same kind of thing, developing the dual process and dual system theories of reasoning. And so I started to get interested in those and collaborated a little bit with Jonathan Evans, who was one of the developers of dual process theory, a cognitive psychologist. And we did a conference together on this. And so I kind of then began to merge this sort of picture that I derived from thinking about folk psychology with the picture that was emerging from cognitive psychology and social psychology too. And I still continue to develop that, and I keep writing papers about the nature of belief and kind of what you might call pathologies of belief, like delusion, this sort of thing. And I do want to kind of pull all that together into another book at some point, which will be a sort of updating of Mind and Supermind, and a rethinking of it all. So that's sort of from being the dominant line, that's kind of moved into being the secondary track in consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness taken the primary one.
As it does, tends to. So do you, so is it the case that you are not an eliminativist about belief, but you are about phenomenal consciousness?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, my attitude to belief, I mean, as I say, I think there are two different kinds of belief, radically different kinds of belief. My attitude to one of them is pretty much is a very weak sort of realism, the sort that Daniel Dennett has. It's a kind of interpretivism, if you like, but I mean it's still a form of realism. It's not outright eliminativism, a la Paul Churchland. And my attitude to phenomenal consciousness is eliminativist. Whereas, of course, Churchland, the Churchlands are actually not eliminativist about phenomenal consciousness. Right. They're reductionists about it. So yes, I'm the kind of sort of mirror image, I suppose.
Yeah, that's interesting. So why is it? What is it about beliefs that you think licenses their reality? It's not first person stuff. It's got to be the third person stuff. Their usefulness or something, or what? Why?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the notion does a lot of work for us. Okay. I think the notion of I mean, my focus is on the second kind of belief, what I call super belief, or loosely you might call conscious belief. My attitude to the other sort, what I call basic belief, is very much the same as Dennett's. I just see it as essentially patterns in behavior that are observable from a certain stance, from the point of view of the intentional stance. I think that's incredibly useful. Sort of, I suppose you might call it a sort of behavioral metric. I think that's a phrase that I'm not sure Dennett has used that phrase. It's incredibly useful. As for conscious belief, the super belief, I think that what we're doing there, we're talking about a certain kind of activity, a certain kind of commitment that we make to a pattern of action, pattern of defending a proposition, using it as a premise, taking it as a premise in reasoning, not being content with conflicts we've detected between it and other things we're committed to, and so on. And so I think that's something that's pretty much observable at the level of in our social interaction, which almost a bit of sort of silence, a noise there. So yes, I mean, I think to some extent the picture of belief that we have there is describing a kind of interaction we have with ourselves and with other people. It's the I don't see it as a theoretical posit in that sense. You see, I see it as an observation of certain kinds of activity that we engage in. So I don't think there's much pressure to eliminate that.
Okay, right, but you would eliminate belief as object of introspection, mental state we encounter when we wonder what we're doing and introspect and say, oh, well, I believe this.
I think these activities that I'm talking about include covert mental activities, activities of intentional generation of mental imageries, let's say in the form of inner speech. But I don't think we have any privilege, well, we have a degree of privileged access to that. It's easier for us to tell what we're imaging than it would be for a neuroscientist to tell. But still, I don't think we have any infallible access to the nature of the processes involved.
Yeah.
And so we could be wrong about what's actually happening or about its significance, yes.
So I guess this is going to be something we're going to talk about eventually, but so I noticed that you're already talking about having infallible access, where I was just wondering if we have any kind of access. So whether it's, forget the qualities that it has, the properties. Is there anything that counts as like accessing the beliefs that we have? I was reading Peter Carruthers' paper recently where he argues that, there are no conscious beliefs. But as I was reading the paper, I mean, my reaction to it was, but yeah, there are. He's describing them when we have these higher order states that attribute to ourselves beliefs. That's what a conscious belief is. There may be no first order states that are accurately described that way, but it just seems to me that that's what we mean when we say introspectively we have access to these things. Not that it's infallible or something like that. That may be tacked on later when we're theorizing, but it's just that, we encounter these things when we try to interpret our own behavior. I mean, but you don't think that.
Well, we certainly engage in self-interpretation, and Peter thinks that, and we can articulate these self-interpretations and articulate them to ourselves and to other people. That's uncontroversial. The accuracy of those self-interpretations is another matter. So let's not so much talk about the higher order beliefs, but higher order reports of what we produce this stream of self-commentary to ourselves and people. And that's real, the commentary is real. Now, I think its accuracy is open to...
Say again?
It's the accuracy of that commentary is not given to us. I mean,
right. It's the accuracy that's not given. I heard. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I may report myself as believing something. Now, depending on what exactly you think the report is doing, if you think it's a report of some persisting state that is disposed to have a certain influence on my behavior and to guide it in certain ways, then I could be wrong about that. Maybe I think that I have some kind of persisting state that disposes me to treat all people equally, regardless of gender or race or whatever, and I could be wrong about that. I don't. Alternatively, you could be seeing the report, and this is more in line with what I talk about as the super belief, as a kind of commitment to doing that. So when I say I believe that all people are equal, what I'm doing is make a kind of commitment to standing by that proposition. Now that seems a bit more unchallengeable because it's kind of forward-looking. Okay, so it's not dependent on my having correctly detected something, some pre-existing state. It's by making a sort of promise to you and to myself that I will stand by that. And so that's, now of course I might not live up to that, but that's quite a different way of being wrong from a failure of introspection. It's a failure of I suppose, prospection and predicting how I will, whether I will stick to the commitment. So I don't in either case see anything here that guarantees the truth of what I say.
Mm-hmm. Why is that relevant to whether you have the conscious experience? I mean, it seems like you're building in something, which would be that an assumption, which would be that if there were a conscious experience around, it would be the thing which was accurately described by this higher order report.
Hang on, sorry, I was thinking there about beliefs, about reports of beliefs rather than experiences.
Well, okay, so about the belief, right. We haven't switched officially yet, but I think the same point will transfer. But so the question is that I was wondering about was why do we have to have the accuracy condition in order to count as having the conscious beliefs, given that so it's building in an assumption about what a conscious belief would be, namely that it requires that there be some kind of belief, which is conscious. And that seems to me to be somewhat question begging.
In relation to conscious belief, I don't think we should do that. I think that's a mistake. As I say, I think what we're doing is making a kind of, an avowal of belief is a kind of performative. It's something more like a promise to yourself and to other people that this is nailing your epistemic colors to the mast and saying this is the policy you're going to follow.
Right.
So
and I like that, but maybe, so I don't mean to cut you off, and I'll let you finish in a second, but it just occurred to me that maybe the word belief is what's causing some unclarity in what I'm trying to say, at least. So what if I switch to the word thought? So are there conscious thoughts on your view?
Well, again, we need to distinguish what we're, would you call that sort? If I say to you, I believe that everyone's, all people are equal. Am I reporting a thought there? No, I'm reporting a, you mean conscious episodes?
Well, what if you said to me, I think all people are equal?
Well, again, I might be just reporting a belief there, but if am I intending to report some kind of conscious episode that I introspected? Not necessarily. Why should I be? I mean, it's like, oh, well, if I said to you, I think all people are equal, I'm not reporting that. Well, just a few microseconds ago, I had some conscious episode with that content. That seems to be an implausible interpretation of what I'm doing.
Well, why would that be the so that's one part of what my question is suppose I say I think all people are equal.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that what I've done is to report a thought of mine that's conscious. But that doesn't seem to commit me to there being some first order thought, which now is conscious.
Right.
That seems to be an assumption. So that's an assumption a lot of people make. But it's built in.
Agree with you on that, but I don't feel that it's a report. I mean, look, what might happen, look, I say to you, I think all people are equal. Now, what I'm doing there, as I understand it, is making a sort of statement either of a kind of policy that I regard myself as committed to or that I am now committing myself to. It's a kind of an announcement of where I stand. If the actual thought kind of runs through my head in a speech, let us say, I think that's doing a similar thing. It's kind of either reminding myself or committing myself afresh to something that I stand on. I don't see it having a descriptive function, except insofar as it's describing one of these commitments that I have, reminding myself of it. I mean, if I'm one example I like is I'm driving to work, and I suddenly remember that. I mean, it's an example that Eric Schwitzgebel also uses, that I can't take the normal route, or that I have some appointment or something different from my normal routine, and so I need to take a different route. And I'm just driving along on autopilot, taking the usual route, and then this thought occurs to me. Now, what it seems to me there is I'm just kind of recalling a kind of commitment, recalling a sort of a kind of a plan or a strategy or an intention of some sort that I'm currently committed to. Now, if I don't recall it, I won't act on it. Precisely because it works as a sort of my behavior is a reaction to that occurrence,
right?
To that particular event, to that reminding myself of some commitment that I've made. So it's not the sort of an activation of some first order state that would have kind of done its work anyway. It wouldn't. It needs to do it by this kind of conscious self-stimulation. It's right. Just like someone else reminds, just like having a passenger sitting next to me who reminds me. Who says, remember the road is closed. Remember you've got to go and do something. It's exactly like that. I am literally reminding myself. And that has the same effect that a report from another person would have. So it's not that this state was there originally, the belief that the road was closed or whatever was there at the first order, just like all the other states that are guiding my current behavior. And somehow it just sort of, the light just came on at that moment. No, it's a totally different, and this is what I was getting at with the idea that there were two very different kinds of things we refer to when we talk about beliefs. Because we might also describe my routine behavior in terms of beliefs and things. We might say that as I'm driving along unconsciously or certainly not attending very closely to what's happening, I have beliefs and thoughts about the other road users, about where I want to go and all this kind of stuff, about the correct route, about how the controls of the car work and so on.
Right.
Though that sort of level of description or discourse is doing a wholly different sort of thing, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that, to be honest. But my question is, so what I was trying to get at was that in that account that you just gave, there seems to be something which clearly maps onto the folk psychological notion of conscious belief. And that's the part where the light goes on and you suddenly have the thought. And that's what we mean by having a conscious thought. It doesn't mean there's some first order state that was there and suddenly gets spotlighted or something. It means in the stream of consciousness, suddenly the thought shows up, and that's what you just described. And that's what a thought is.
It depends look, I mean, one way of thinking of the stream of consciousness is that it's like a bunch of first order states that are kind of doing their normal work, quietly under the radar, and then they get picked out by the spotlight of consciousness, and that's the stream of consciousness. Now, that's not at all how I think of the stream of consciousness. I think the stream of consciousness is a stream of imagery. I think it's all imagistic. I think it's all sensory based. I agree with Carruthers about that, and Jesse Prince. And I think what we call the stream of consciousness is, to a large extent, not wholly, a stream of inner speech. So it is really functionally no different from private speech, from just talking out loud to yourself. There's no question here of a light going on or anything. It's just a certain sort of activity that happens to be kind of short-circuited, that doesn't involve the overt vocalization.
I mean, so it does sound to me like you are an eliminativist about belief, then.
Well,
about all the beliefs, about every kind of belief. Well, I don't see anything about a belief-like in what you're describing. I mean, so the behaviorists, you know, they said, you know, beliefs are just you acting in various ways, or dispositions to act in various ways. Unconscious beliefs are just your dispositions. Conscious beliefs are the things you avoid the table and so forth and so on. There's an element of that in your basic belief account, I would say. And then at the super-sized belief, there's just this kind of more of that, but for a different purpose, so to speak. So I don't really see where the non-eliminativism is supposed to come.
Well, I'm
especially about the folk category.
Well, I don't know. I think philosophers have read quite a lot into the folk vocabulary. I'm eliminativist about certain conceptions of belief. I don't think we have beliefs in the sense that Jerry Fodor thought we had beliefs. No, it's an open question about what the sort of subpersonal basis of all this stuff is. There could be discrete things that the basic mind that could be supported by a kind of level of subpersonal information processing that is very discrete and chunked just in the way that folk psychology says it is. I don't think folk psychology is committed to that, or that needs to be true in order for. I don't think it's committed to the kind of propositional modularity down there at the subpersonal level. To use the phrase from Ramsey Stitch and Garon. Now, so I'm eliminativist about some conceptions of belief, but then everybody is eliminativist about the conceptions of that they don't agree with. The way I'm not an eliminativist is that I think that folk psychology is doing something very useful, and that it's picking out real states, maybe not in discrete internal information processing states, but certainly real states of the person to whom they're ascribed, and that it does real explanatory and predictive work. It's really useful, and it's doing, as you say, the basic and the super levels of description doing different things, but they're in the same broad category. And yeah, I think it's useful. Now, there's the contrast with how I think about phenomenal consciousness. I think the notion there is just an obstacle to making progress. So I think that there isn't a way of construing the concept. I mean, there are ways of construing it where you could still be realistic about it, but I think they're so tenuous that it's not doing anything useful. I think we've got other concepts that will do all the work we need to do. And the reason I want to eliminate it is I think it just brings in a bunch of intuitions that distort our thinking. And so that's why I'm quite. As soon as you say that you deny, so we are switching now, but it's kind of to do with the issue of eliminativism. In saying I deny the existence of phenomenal consciousness, it looks like I'm making. I mean, let's face, as Galen Strawson says, the
silliest claim in the history of
human thought. Now, one thing to do there is to say, well, of course, I'm not really denying the existence of consciousness.
Well, that's what I say when people say that about you.
Yeah, and in a sense, that's right. But it sounds, and of course, that immediately sounds like equivocation and that you're on the back foot. And there is a sense in which I'm not, and we can try and sort this out. But at the same time, I'm willing to take a certain amount of this on the chin. And I do try to take it on the chin because I am denying something that I think is, if not the everyday common sense conception of consciousness, it is something that is very easily extrapolated from that. You don't have to push people too far to get them into this conception of consciousness. So it's not, I don't think it's the everyday one, but it's something not too far from it. And we're all familiar with the bit of work you need to do to get your students from the place where they start into the place where they now see the hard problem.
Right.
And it's that bit of work. Okay. Now, and I think that's very natural. And once you've done that step, it becomes very easy to think that's the natural view that everyone starts with. I don't think it is, but Anyway, and now that conception, so which can seem the obvious one, certainly to people who are in the debate, that I am eliminativist about that concept. I think it's talking about trying to find the neural correlates of that, I think is a fool's errand. I think it's just going to distort our thinking, distort our research, just lead us into puzzles that can never be solved, and it's completely unfruitful. So I'm prepared to take a certain amount of this on the chin,
right,
in order to emphasize that there's some rethinking needs doing, and I suppose in the way that some people are willing to be eliminativists about free will. I mean, you can perfectly well be a kind of realist about free will while accepting determinism.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad. It's interesting that you brought that up, because I was gonna actually ask about that comparison, because there are people like Dennett, right?
Yep.
So Dennett's a realist about free will, but he's a compatibilist. But he's apparently an eliminativist about consciousness. But why? So, I mean, when I read the debate between Dennett and Caruso, which I don't know if you saw that debate, but so Caruso's probably more on your side about the eliminativism, right? For free will, at least, and Dennett is not, but yet they agree on like a lot of the details. The difference is really just how they want to describe what's going on there. So, is something similar going on here? Do you think?
I think so. I take it down. Think so. There's a perfectly good notion of free will, which doesn't involve any commitment to things like the agent causation,
right,
contra, causal processes, and in fact he thinks that is pretty much the everyday one.
Right.
And all the work we need the concept to do can be done by a concept that's perfectly compatible with determinism, for example. Now, I think probably Greg is addressing people who have very strong intuitions about the metaphysical nature of free will,
right,
and who do believe in agent causation, who do believe there's an incompatibility, and so he's simply denying that kind of free will exists, and Dan would deny it too. But they're kind of addressing different audiences and different concerns.
Right.
Okay, they're the people who wanted to do if you wanted to do this kind of work, well then there's nothing that will do that kind of work. If you wanted to do this other kind of work, well, yes, of course there's a concept that will do that kind of work. And I think it depends who your opponents are, which now, so I'd be happy with certain ways of talking about consciousness that are pretty realist, but not for the people that I'm arguing against, not for the people who I take it are distorting, not intentionally distorting, people who are taking us down the wrong path.
Right. So, so when you're arguing with Strawson and David Chalmers, you want to toe the eliminativism, but if you're arguing with someone else, you're happy to say, okay, well, as long as you're not putting any magic in here, I could be a realist.
Yes, although I think what happens if you're not putting magic in is, or the only question, if you don't have the magic in, is where to pin the label phenomenal consciousness on which bit of the processing story that you tell. And I think that is a kind of profoundly uninteresting question, really. So, yes, you could be realist, you could pin the label wherever you want, but whatever. We can know everything we need to know about what's happening without even you. I don't see the concept is, unless the concept is doing magic, I don't think it's doing anything useful, put it like that.
So yeah, this is, I think, where some of the things that probably are most fundamentally dividing us are going to come up, because there's a lot we agree on, obviously, but I think around here, maybe not. So one of my complaints, and so I want to hear how you would possibly respond to a complaint like this, which you've heard from me before. So one of my complaints is that that physicalists give up too easy. And sort of what I hear you doing is that. So when we're arguing, because physicalism is not something that I I'm pretty committed to it. My deepest sympathies are with some kind of identity theory, mind brain. That's where my heart really is. And I could be convinced out of it. And I know there's some issues, but I think that there's good reasons to accept it. And that's probably my strongest commitment, my whole professional career, is that no one has shown the identity theory is wrong. Okay. So that doesn't mean it's right, obviously. But so I have physicalist leanings, I would say. But given that, it seems that a lot of other people who also are physicalists want to say, look, we're interested in explaining the mind and consciousness, but not that stuff that you're talking about. That stuff that you just mentioned, the stuff that we know about from the first person, the stuff that seemingly sits not well with what we know about the physical world and so forth and so on. That's not what we're talking about. And that seems already to me to admit defeat, to say, look, we can't do it, so let's do something else. Instead, as a physicalist, my goal would be to see an account of the thing that they're talking about. So arguing with the Strawsons of the world, and taking what they think about consciousness and saying that's physical, and here's how it could be physical, what you're talking about. But that's not a project that you seem like you're interested in, or that you think can even be completed. Is that a fair way of characterizing?
It's not an unfair way. Well, look, you know Dennett's notion of heterophenomenology, which is just everything you're inclined to say about your experience, the whole report, the detailed account of how things seem to you, the discriminations you can make, the sort of everything that the phenomenologists do,
right?
In terms of an explicit report. Okay, all of that needs explaining why they're inclined to say all these sorts of things. Okay, what Dennett is then reluctant to do is to say, and that report is an accurate representation of some subjective reality, which is only accessible by the person making the report. Now, I think if you say that, then you've straight away committed yourself to something that is completely unverifiable, because all you have is the report. All you have are the things that that can be observed and measured. So there's no way that a subjective reality can be investigated by science. Okay. Now you might
investigate it directly.
Investigate. Well, you can assume correlations, but then you can't check those correlations. There's no way that you can check. That lovely example that Dan has, where you decide you're going to really get to grips with subjectivity, and so you connect up two people with brain interfaces. And so you have a helmet on, and I have a helmet on, and we connect them up like this. And I say, oh my God, Richard's subjective world is totally inverted relative to mine. All the colors are.
Hey, you're inverted relative to me, buddy.
And then the engineer who's setting this up comes along and says, oh, hang on a second. And he kind of unclips the connector between the two, inverts it 180 degrees and plugs it back in. And now suddenly we go, it's fine now. Now this problem, how you calibrate, how you would calibrate an experience comparator. You just reflect on that a little bit, and you just see that there is absolutely no way you could calibrate it. There's no way. It all depends on assumptions about how the correlations between the observable stuff and the unobservable stuff, how they go, and there is absolutely no way of checking those. You can't be just a little bit essentially subjective. So once you buy into this, then okay, you're maybe not buying into non-physicals, but you're certainly buying into non-explicability. Okay.
Yeah.
This is just, yes, there could be this kind of real subjective world there that corresponds exactly to the detailed heterophenomenology. But it really is the kind of beetle in the box that is just doing no work, is invisible to science. The idea of a first-person science, it just doesn't hold up.
Yeah, I guess there I would want to press you a little bit on some of those claims. So I mean, heterophenomenology is fine for what it is, but there's also homophenomenology. So why? So as a philosopher, you must have taught intro to philosophy 1,000 times, at least. What do you do with the process of Cartesian doubt? So do you just think Descartes off his rocker when he says he gets to the point where he can coherently envision what's happening right now as a dream? And so that you can sort of do the Husserlian bracketing of the physical world and consider what's going on right now just as an experience. And when you're in that kind of Cartesian doubt mode, isn't it kind of obvious that there is consciousness, and shouldn't that be a starting point? Because in all of this discussion so far, that hasn't come up. Well, not even as like something we should be suspicious of and take with a grain of salt, but it's just, you know, start from the third person, do heterophenomenology, and then see what's there. But why isn't the starting point something like the Cartesian doubt, or something like, you know, you have to get some intuitions going, but why isn't that a way of shining the spotlight on what we're trying to explain as opposed to the thing you're talking about?
Well, I'm not sure Descartes is completely your friend here. I mean, after all, it's conscious, it's particularly conscious cognition that is the thing for him. You know, it's well known, you know, that the sensory experience provides a certain kind of is a problem for Descartes, you know, because it does seem to be heavily dependent on the body. Now, what really, you know, what he really needs to rely on is conscious thought, pure intellect. You know, right. That's what really. So it's not clear that, you know, qualia are really going to do any work for him in that debate anyway.
Unless they're a cognitive phenomenon, but I understand what you're saying, and there is a whole history of people debating about what happens to the non-material soul in heaven on Descartes' view. Do you just do math, or can you taste chocolate or not? So yeah, there is a problem.
I'm not sure that. But let's look. What? Okay, what can we not do? Well, okay, I'm looking at the sky now. Something's happening. Something is going off. Something is occurring, which I can just sort of gesture at. This is happening. This is going off. Yeah. Well, that's pretty undoubtable. The demonstrative, I guess, is latching onto something there, but that's virtually contentless. It's like saying, you know, I am here, or, you know, the time is now. Okay.
But those can be verified.
Well, we don't know what this is latching onto. That's the point.
But that's where the science would come in, right? So that's kind of the two prongs of it.
But I'm not. There's nothing in that creates any kind of hard problem. There's nothing there.
Oh no, I wasn't talking about a hard problem. I'm just talking about a datum. Well, that there is something that's happening and we'd want to find out what it is.
Something's happening. It's
generating it.
But I don't see that now that I've already bought into anything that involves the acceptance of phenomenal consciousness. I mean, after all, what does seem to be happening? Well, let's just say what does seem to. Well, it seems that I'm some kind of being, you know, a human being who is in contact with a world, and some kind of contact with the world out there, which seems to be painted over with all kinds of qualitative properties. There seem to be colors, the sky and the walls opposite, and so on, and they all seem to be out there quite firmly. And there are sounds and smells and other things, and there are certain feelings that seem to be in my physical body. Now that's what the starting point. I seem to be living in what David Chalmers would call Eden, you know, a world where all of this qualitative stuff is out there for me. Now that's my kind of base point, right? Now the trouble is that science comes along and says, well, that's sort of illusory. Those qualitative things aren't really out there in the way that they seem to be. After all, to other people it looks different, to aliens, to animals it would all look different. What's really out there is just you know, sort of electromagnetic radiation bouncing off surfaces of different kinds of textures and so on. well, okay. So even my first starting point now is, well, how? What do I do now? But, so these qualitative things that you're telling me that they're illusory, the scientist. What do I do? Well, I don't know. They still seem very real. They must be, well, maybe they must be in here then instead of being out there. Now we start to get phenomenal consciousness. Now we start to get the hard problem. But that's already a move in response to a scientific correction of how things initially seemed.
Right.
So now, so I start here with common sense. Science corrects me. I then make a kind of theoretical move, and then I come along and say that the other people make the theoretical move that the stuff's in here, and then I come along and say, well, I don't think that theoretical move's a good one. And my opponents say, oh, but that's where we started. No, we started over there with these things being out in the world. So I don't think, now it may be that theoretical move to project these things sort of inward is a good one, but it's not our starting point. Our common sense.
Well, the starting point is the kind of the doubt. That's what I was trying to get at, was that. So I agree with the history of everything you just said. I agree with 100%. So what pushes us back into the mind, so to speak, is what Chalmers called eating from the tree of illusion, or science, or whatever, in his Eden paper. And so that's what you were kind of describing, I think. Then there's also, dreaming, considerations about dreaming, and phantom limb pain that Descartes talks about. So it's not, you're right, it's a lot of moves in response to science, but also common sense, I would say, for dreaming at least. But the end of all of that is that you can start looking around at the things that are out there and think, yeah, well, I could be in a dream right now. This could be a dream. And if this were a dream, then yeah, these are products of the conscious experience that I'm having. So let's try to figure out how brains do that. And that's an explanation of consciousness. So yeah, you could work yourself back a couple of steps, and maybe you don't like those moves, but it doesn't seem like you would be in the mood for eliminating anything. You'd be in the mood for trying to figure out what thing it is that you've sort of latched onto and how it relates to the physical underpinnings of the brain or body, which is a good project for science. Now, I agree with you that there's the subjectivity part, which is going to throw some kind of water on our parade here. But I wonder, so when you're doing philosophy, philosophers love certainty. Scientists don't care about it as much. So it doesn't seem to me like science really cares that there's this unbridgeable subjectivity gap. What they care about is building models that predict and are explanatory, and you can do that without certainty. So without saying, I know for certain that you're conscious. I can be reasonably confident because you have similar brain structures that I do that perform similar functions, and that's good enough for science. So that's good enough for a project of trying to explain the thing that we did in the Cartesian room. So where on that path towards kind of what I would consider the way consciousness and from the first person and the third person kind of meet in the middle here, would you think is the problem?
Sorry, there was a lot there.
There was, sorry.
Look, I have difficulty getting a grip on what the facts of this first person world are supposed to be, other than the facts of hetero. I think all I have, as it were, is hetero. All I have about myself is what I'm inclined to tell myself. What is it like for me now? Right. Well, until I ask that question, I'm not really sure. But now I've asked it, I can start noticing things. I can start noticing the little lights here on the camera in front of me, and I can start noticing, which I was looking at rather than you, and now I can look at you and the screen, and I can look at, and I can start telling myself a story about what I'm experiencing. Okay. And I may be inclined to say things like, I have this really rich and detailed phenomenal world, here, or at least world of experience here. But then if you start to question me about it a bit more and say, okay, so what's at the periphery? I say, well, actually, I'm not quite so sure. And it turns out to be more degraded than I thought it was. And, I can start to try to explare this.
Right. But then you would just be pushing towards weak illusionism, right? Not illusionism.
Well, no, I'm just not sure that it's Sure, look. These reports, they're coming from somewhere. Okay, they're coming. I'm tapping into processes. Representational processes of various kinds that are leading me to produce these reports. But they're tapping into a kind of subjective world that is exactly as I describe it. That seems to me that's where the kind of fictional element is. What I'm kind of doing is kind of constructing a kind of notional subjective world as I report it to myself and to you.
Right.
And
but I hate to keep interrupting you, but this point I think is the point that I've been trying to press on since the beginning of our discussion with the cognitive stuff too. So a lot of what seems to be driving your pessimism here is that these things have to be accurate, that there's got to be something which actually matches at the level of mental reality, the way I'm describing it, in order for realism to be true. And that seems to me to be too much. I mean, even Chalmers is an illusionist of some sort, of a weak variety, because he thinks that the representations of phenomenal redness don't track anything out there, because we don't live in Eden. So that, that's a kind of illusionism, but but not the strong kind, because there's a phenomenal property there.
Look, I mean, all of this, as intentional objects, of course, all this is stuff, as the content of my representation. My world is the world of my representations, okay? So, all this is as real as the content of the stories I create. This is the world I create for myself through, as it were, heterophenomenology, through what I tell myself and tell others. And it's real for me in that sense, that it's part of my story. And that's why I'm authoritative about it, because if I say, look, I do or don't notice something at a particular moment, then that's it. There's nothing more to it than that. There isn't any independent fact that can be checked against it. It's just part of the story I tell at that moment. Ask me a fraction of a second later, I might have given you a different response. Which is the thing that Dennett makes all the time. You're kind of constructing this on the fly all the time. And content of my representations is perfectly it's as real as you think intentional objects are. And it's there for me in virtue of being in my representations. Now, if this is the Richard that I'm with totally about this, okay? This is the Richard that I'm totally with. If this is how you see it, then I'm on the same page with you. If the phenomenality is in the content of the higher order representations, in the representation of mental qualities, this is the thing I do not understand about higher order thought, is what mental qualities are. I've never understood this. I don't really know what Rosenthal means, but I don't know what. Anyway, so if what you mean by that is representations of non-instantiated properties, phenomenal properties, that kind of populate your subjective world and that exist as the virtue as being the content of your higher order representation, then I'm with you, and you're an illusionist, and we're all happy.
Or I'm with you, and you're not an illusionist, and we're even more happy.
If you mean that we have these higher order representations, and they have a certain content which is a representation of mental qualities, which are not quite phenomenal properties themselves, but somehow by having that representation of a mental quality, which isn't itself a phenomenal property, the state itself then acquires a phenomenal property, and thereby I acquire it, then we don't agree. And that's the Richard that I don't agree with. That if you think that the mental quality represented isn't the phenomenal redness is a kind of property of the whole of the higher order representation. Now, it seems to me that's where I see the ambivalence in your position. On the one hand, you seem to be, so the first one is a kind of, it's a type A materialist, it's a illusionist, it's lovely. The second one is more like a type B materialist. There's an explanatory gap between how, and maybe you need to go down to the biological realization to get the actual identity. And yes, you can posit an identity here, but it's an inexplicable one.
It's
just correlation, and that's the bad Richard. And I'm reading your writing. I sometimes, I see good. I'm sorry, I don't mean this. It's just I sometimes see the good Richard. I think, yeah, I'm absolutely on board with this. And I love this, and I love what you're doing with the emotion story. And I think this is great. This is wonderful. This is using all the resources of this essentially illusionist picture to do great stuff that really is, advancing our understanding of this. And then there's the other one, I think now it's just slipping back in.
Right. So yeah, and that's good that you've been. I mean, that's what I was hoping to address in the piece I was allegedly going to write.
I really want.
It was bad timing, unfortunately, but yeah, I'm still going to write that piece someday because I think
I really want to see that piece.
I think the point you're raising is a good one, and cards on the table. I am kind of ambivalent as between type B and type A physicalism, and most of the days, I mean, in my own writing, I say I'm a type C physicalist, although really that's one or the other in the long run. So probably type A in the long run, or who knows. But so I think there is a tension there, in at least the way I think of things, because I'm not sure which of those is the best strategy. I think they're both workable, actually. So taking the one that you like, the good Richard, let's try to make that less good, because I don't think that that one is as good as you like. So it just kind of relates to the Rosenthal point that you made in passing, which is what are the mental qualities, and also relates to a point I was getting at way back at the beginning of this discussion, about how we want to start doing this. So the story that you told about, hey, where are the qualitative properties? They're not out there. Let's put them in the mind. That's, the Galileo story. Rosenthal's called that the relocation story. Shoemaker called it something else. I forget what his term for it was. But lots of people have pointed this move out, right? That this is a kind of, even Austin Clark, he has this wonderful paper on this, where the history of the qualia being kicked inside. It's a convoluted history. So that's a well taken point. However, I would say that part of what's going on there is where the problem arises, because in the kicking it in, what we kicked in was the qualities as consciously experienced. So when you look at the table is red and green. And then you say, well, but out there's only electromagnetic radiation. So the red and green must be a property of my mind somehow. And then the red and the green, as consciously experienced, get thought of as somehow properties of the mind. But that leads to all sorts of mysteries. Like, how could something like that, just the way I experience it, it's just a simple thing. But if instead you split those and you think that what gets put into the mind is a mental quality, a way of representing the physical property, but in a non-conceptual way. So that's what a mental quality would be in the most general sense. It's a way of representing a physical quality, a physical property, without conceptual resources, in some sort of analog way. Rosenthal says homomorphism or quality space theory. I don't know. It's whatever your preferred theories. It's kind of an analog representation, something mirroring the relations or capturing the relations between this family of properties in the mind. But that doesn't necessarily need to be conscious. That could be these basic sorts of qualities, as to steal your term. So those things don't present any problem to science. So what in here is allowing me to sort of be responsive to the physical property of red? There's something that's letting me do it. Let's call that the mental quality of red. So there's no assumption about it being conscious, about it being mysterious. It's just a functional property of the mind, of the brain. Now, then, when you consciously experience that, when the thing that was giving you the problem before shows up, the story goes, well, there's got to be some sort of awareness of that mental quality. And the way you have the awareness is by having a higher order state that represents you as being in that qualitative state. So the experience of the quality comes in from you being aware of what's going on down there. The quality itself is just a representation of some physical property. So nowhere in that story is anything mysterious or fishy going on. We've got the conscious experience as a result of the higher order awareness. The conscious experience says, I am having a red quality, basically. You are, in fact, having that quality because you're representing the physical property. So there's no illusion. Where's the illusion here? That's not an illusionist account, because you're correctly describing what's going on at the first order level.
I think I think it should be illusionist in the sense, I think that the mental quality, I mean, the mental quality here then is just a sort of functional property of the brain. Okay?
Right.
So this is what I've used the term quasi-phenomenal. Let's just use that term, quasi-phenomenal property, because after all, it can occur without any sense of it having any field. Okay. So it's, you know, it's perfectly objective. Mary can know everything about it, no problem. Okay.
Right.
So this is it generates none of the problems of a phenomenal consciousness. Okay. So I'm quite happy with mental quality. I'll call them quasi-phenomenal because, you know, for obvious reasons. Now, yes, and then we introspect that and we represent it to ourselves. The illusion comes in, I suggest, in that we misrepresent it not as a functional, non-phenomenal property, but precisely as a simple, intrinsic, ineffable, qualitative, phenomenal property. It comes in the misrepresentation of that. My idea is that essentially illusionism can be seen, I think, as a version of the phenomenal concept strategy, with the rider that these phenomenal concepts are kind of rich. They're not just very thin demonstratives. They have a theoretical element. They're building this notion of intrinsicality, of phenomenality, simplicity, non-physicality, probably. Not just that they're not physical concepts, they're building something like non-physicality, possibly. And we apply that, so it's a kind of, there's a sortal attached to the demonstrative. It's this kind of thought, this kind of state, this kind of phenomenal state. Okay, so where we're misrepresenting the target quasi-phenomenal state as phenomenal. That's where the illusion comes in. And I think that's...
But that's weak illusionism. I mean, so I want to keep this distinction between weak and strong in mind.
No, that's not weak illusionism, because the phenomenal aspect is illusory. The thing that's being represented is quasi-phenomenal, doesn't generate any of the problems of phenomenal consciousness.
Right.
Now, if you're happy to say that those things, these functional states of the brain are phenomenal properties, even though they can occur non-consciously, they generate none of the problems, they're totally accessible to third-person side, then okay, you have the word if you want. I think quasi-phenomenal is better precisely because it distinguishes makes that distinction.
Well, so this is, again, I don't want to keep harping on the same point, but this is kind of the point that I've been trying to get across, is that you, in our discussion here, it seems like you keep wanting to say that the phenomenal properties have to be at the first order level. They've got to be the quasi-phenomenal property, the mental quality of red, whatever you want to call it, that thing's got to have it. And what I'm suggesting is that that's kind of a mistake, which generates all of the puzzles. That's the problem right there, is that's a theoretical importation on your part, not part of the ordinary conception of phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness, as I take it, is just the idea that there's something that is like to be me. It's a property that I have. And then the specific properties that I have are the way in which it is. The redness here, the blueness there, the pain over here, the feeling of hunger, the thought here, the thought there. So those things populate what it's like for me. But the basic explanandum, the thing we're trying to get at here, is that there is something that is like for me. And it's a separate and further question whether that's got to be somehow a property of these quasi-phenomenal states, or a property of the individual, or a property of the higher order state, or what. But that's what we're trying, or that's what I take us to be explaining, not the properties of the first order states.
I'm not convinced that sort of talk really does pick out a clear explanandum. It might pick out something, but I'm not sure that it picks out a unique one or a very well-defined one. Yes, I know we do this. We gesture in this way, but I mean, look. Again, it's this retreat inwards. Look, now, I believe that say that the books I ordered to provide. Why do I believe that the books I ordered to provide? Because there's the postman is at the door. Why do I believe that the postman is at the door? Because the doorbell is ringing. Why do I believe the doorbell is ringing? Because I hear the doorbell. Why do I believe I hear the doorbell? Right, I just do. But
well, because you hear the doorbell.
Sometimes I hear a door. I judge that I hear a doorbell when there isn't a doorbell ringing. Okay, so it must have actually been because I had some sort of inner sensation, doorbelly sensation, which is normally connected with doorbells ringing. Now, here's I think where you make where the mistake goes. Because we can be our judgments about the sensible properties of the world can be erroneous. We think, because we can be fallible about the way the world is, we kind of think we must be infallible about the way the inner world is. Okay, but no, we're just reaching the limits of our, of our own access, to the processes involved. There's, really complicated causal chains here, and we can trace some of them, and in a crude way, at a certain point they stop, and that's when we start gesturing at what it's like and what's going on. Well, yes, there's something going off there. Yes, there's certainly something occurring, but that we're right to conceptualize it in this term of talk of fields and ineffable things that are somehow non-functional and could in principle come apart from the functional processes, and that we know immediately in some sort of way that doesn't require any kind of representation or cognitive access. And now that's all a theoretical importation.
Right,
what we did was we started gesturing at this kind of realm of the sort of the interface between ourselves and the world. Okay, and we just started gesturing this, and of course there's got to have to be an interface. I know cognitive system can have complete transparent self-access, and if it did, I think then we wouldn't see any problems. But until we gesture at that, and then we start building little theoretical constructions around that. Now, as to what level the phenomenal consciousness comes in, that precisely seems to be one of the bad questions. Is it a property of the first order states? Is it a property of the higher order states? That's why it's not helpful to have the concept, because where you're if you have a naturalistic picture, well, then it's just a kind of, you can pin it in different places depending on how you sort of, pull the theoretical levers, but nothing really matters because you have the full picture without it of what's happening. Now, if you're a realist in the sense that, yes, there really is this fuzzy sort of glowy radioactive stuff in there, no, where that is, that's a real question. But otherwise, it's just a matter. I mean, here's one thing that puzzles. Sorry, I did a lot of stuff. That one thing that puzzles me about your view is you sometimes want to talk about one thing you rightly criticize Bloch for is how there could be kind of immediate awareness of phenomenal properties of first order level, without them being represented. But then sometimes you talk about the higher order representations being phenomenally conscious without themselves being represented. So haven't you got just the same problem that Bloch has? Now, if you want to say that the phenomenal properties are the content of those higher order states, then great, yeah, absolutely, no problem. But if you want to say those higher order states in virtue of their contents become phenomenally conscious, then how do we become aware of that phenomenal consciousness?
Well, what I would want to say is that those states are the phenomenal consciousness. That they don't become anything. They just, that's what they are.
How are we,
they're intrinsically
how are we aware of it? What's our access to it? Do they just glow intrinsically?
Well, I don't know what glowing means in this context, but
I don't know what phenomenal consciousness means in this context.
It means the states that explain what it's like for us.
But without our being aware of them, without our representing them in any way.
That's right.
Well, then this does seem to me. What is the subject that is aware of them? The
way I would. I mean, I don't want to make this too much about my own views, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Sorry, I don't want to put you on the back.
No, I'm fine. This is fine.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, who's doing the interviewing around here?
Sorry.
No, this is great. We're here to have this conversation. I guess what I would say is that the content of the right kind of state has roughly something we'd express in English as like, I am seeing red. Whether it's written that way in the brain, obviously different question, but it says something that you would express as I am seeing red. Mm-hmm. And the I am part attributes to you the content of having a psychological state of seeing red, but the red is out there. The seeing is a mental thing. So it's already kind of giving you the sense that there's a you that's seeing it, and then you're attributing that state to yourself. So the awareness that I think is crucial for phenomenal consciousness is the higher order state itself, and it's explained cognitively in the way that we normally explain that stuff. And what I think that the reason why I think Bloch has the problem that I don't have is because Bloch wants to say that whatever kind of awareness there is that is crucially involved with phenomenal consciousness, which he does say that's a datum, can be explained in some non-cognitive way, either deflationary, like the way we smile our own smiles, or in some other mysterious way. So the objection is just that if you want awareness to be part of the property, then it should be something that we understand. And I think that the stuff I'm talking about is something we understand, but the stuff Block is talking about isn't.
I think that's right. And I think the explanatory power of your account lies wholly in the content of the high order representations. And
yeah, but part of the content is that I am seeing.
Exactly, and that does the work. And then the quality that's attributed to the first order state, or the supposed first order state, that captures the phenomenal aspect. Yes, it's all in the content.
No, the whole thing captures the phenomenal aspect. The phenomenal aspect is that I am seeing red.
Yeah, okay,
that's the phenomenal aspect.
Okay, yeah, that I am seeing. Yeah, okay, fine. But that's all impacted within the content. You don't then need to say, and then that higher order, that higher order representation then is phenomenally conscious. You understand what I think that Goodrich says, that higher order representation explains everything we want to say about phenomenal consciousness. All the heterophenomenology, all the reports are explained in virtue of the content of that higher order representation. We don't need to say, and then it really is phenomenally conscious as well, because then you have the problem of, well, so how is this phenomenal? So it gets that content, and then bingo, that's phenomenally conscious. Everything we need to explain about phenomenal consciousness is explained in terms of the content of that state, without saying that the state itself is phenomenally conscious, because then we just reintroduce the problem. We've kind of, as it were, explained it away really nicely, and then sort of bad Richard said that. Sorry, I don't mean to keep putting you on this. But I do want to press you on this, because I think you've got to. I think the reason I'm pressing you is because I think, of course I could be wrong, but I think the good Richard has got a really excellent story.
Thank you. I've had some people contact me and say they want to like take what I say and use it for illusionism, and I said, yeah, that's a good way to go. I don't go that way.
I read your the paper with Michael Ledoux, was it?
Yeah, Joe Ledoux.
Joe, lovely. I loved it. I really did. But it's that last step. You just and then this higher representation is phenomenally conscious. That explains phenomenal consciousness. That explains all that needs to be explained about phenomenal consciousness, all the intuitions and everything.
Right. So I mean, so there are two different things I would say here, and this is part of my split personality between type A and type B. So in one mode of thinking, I would say, look, these identities are arrived at scientifically by the kind of work that the identity lets us do. And so here I'm being very influenced by the view that Block has about how scientific identities are established. Yeah. Why do we think water is H2O? Well, because by making that identity, we can explain a bunch of stuff, like why water freezes at a certain temperature, which if we didn't make that identity, we wouldn't be able to explain that. So the identity is not discovered, it's postulated because of explanatory usefulness. So in that mode of thinking, I would say, yeah, okay, so here we have this very useful representation. It's the thing which explains everything that we wanted to have explained. So that's what it is. That's all there is to it. And we picked out a certain thing sort of intuitively. We've looked, we've seen what does that. And so if you identify the conscious experience of pain with this representation, you can explain things that you can't explain otherwise. So I don't think you get the full explanation without the
I think I see better now. You know David Chalmers' recent paper on the meta problem.
Yes.
Okay, so essentially I think what you're saying is you've got a really excellent solution to the meta problem, okay, which is the horror theory, yeah? And that solution is also the solution to the hard problem.
Although, if you're type B physicalist, there isn't an explanation to the hard problem.
Okay, the target of that, the target of the set of states that you propose as the explanation you give to the meta problem picks out the state that is phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so you identify the phenomenal consciousness with the state that solves the meta problem. So solving the meta problem is the way to home in on what consciousness is, whatever solves the meta problem. Now, the thing is, as I say, all that further step is doing there is just vindicating the intuition, the realist intuition that you had in the first. That's the only thing that it's actually doing. It's not adding any further explanatory or predictive power, because the solution to the meta problem does all of that. It explains all the reactions, all the judgments, all the dispositions. It explains everything that is detectable from a scientific perspective. All that further step does is say, and that's what phenomenal consciousness is real, and that's what it is. So
that's not all that it does. It lets us explain certain kinds of behavior, which I don't think would be fully explained without it.
Now that I'm doubtful about that, because I think the solution to the meta problem would do that. And then of course you've got the problem of how that works, how these.
Well, I mean, if the view that I like is right, then phenomenal consciousness ultimately is just another kind of representation in the brain, and representations have cause and effect powers. And so it would be a kind of empirical question: what cause and effect power this kind of representation
it does all of that in virtue of its being the representational state, the functional state, or the neural state. It doesn't. The fact that it's phenomenally conscious isn't a changing its causal powers. It's just it's a sort of
right. And saying that water is H2O doesn't change H2O's causal powers, but it lets you explain things about water that you can't explain without that link.
Yes, but
so this would let us explain things about conscious pain that you couldn't explain without it.
Case of water.
Sorry?
There isn't an explanatory gap in the case of water. I mean, the identity there is an intelligible one.
Well, no, if you're a type B physicalist, there's always an explanatory gap here. Yeah. It's not intelligible. It's postulated. It's something that's you have to. So if you're a type B physicalist, which some days I am, and for the next 5 minutes, I guess I will be, then you don't explain or make intelligible identities. You postulate them because of the benefits of doing so. And that's it. That gives you some explanatory power. So making this identity allows you to explain why conscious pain does what it does, why I go to the medicine cabinet and take an aspirin if I consciously have a migraine, but I don't do so if I unconsciously have a migraine. Those are differences which these kinds of identities help us understand. That's what identities do on this on type B accounts.
But I have all the explanation. I have a perfectly good explanation of that. The illusionist has pretty much exactly the same explanation. I mean, in terms of the states, the functional states and processes involved. The illusionist can make exactly that same range of discriminations between conscious and unconscious, give exactly the same range of explanations. They just don't have the rider, and these states that I'm mentioning are identical with phenomenal consciousness.
I mean, that would be a bit weird if you did that with water. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, it would, but in the case of water, it's very easy to see, well, relatively easy to see why the two things are the same. You haven't introduced, you don't need to be a type B physicalist about water. That's the point. So,
but you do actually if you talk to chemists, because actually understanding these identities is very hard. There's this really excellent book that more people need to read about water and H2O. Which I'm blanking on right now. But anyway, there is a hard problem of water. It's just no one wants to talk about it. So, we like to hand wave and say, oh, yeah. Mean molecular energy. And if it slows down, the lattice structure shows up. And now we understand. Well, actually, I would dispute the details of that. We don't understand in the way that we think that we do. But so I would argue for a kind of hard problem of water. And I think Bloch makes a good case for that in his paper. There could be ghost water. How do we rule that out? So forth, so on. Okay. So, but even if you don't like that kind of stuff, so if I switch to the type A side of me, then what I would say is, look, we start off with some kind of conceptual analysis of what consciousness is. Folk psychology tells us that if there's a state that you are not aware of being in, then that's not a conscious state. So an implication of that is that being conscious requires being aware in some sense. So where in the brain is the awareness? It's the higher order one. Deduction, that's the consciousness. So that's a different way of thinking about how you get the identity, but I would equally defend that route as well. So either way you get the conclusion, I would say that the best result is to identify phenomenal consciousness with a certain sort of state of the brain.
I'm if yeah, okay. I mean, if you I mean, I'm happy if you want to use the word phenomenal consciousness or whatever is distinctive about these kinds of things, then I'm these kind of episodes as opposed to other sorts of episodes, then I'm fine to do that.
But that's what I know,
No,
but you should be fine to do that because that's what everyone is doing. That's all that's ever been going on.
But it isn't, because it isn't, because what might be distinctive about those episodes is that they involve the illusory representation of phenomenality, and not everyone's happy with that.
Yeah. Well, who isn't happy with that?
People who deny illusionism.
What you just said was weak illusionism.
No, I said that there are certain sorts of episodes, okay, which we describe as conscious experiences, okay. We call phenomenally conscious. What's distinctive about those episodes, okay, as opposed to episodes of perceptual awareness that are not conscious in that way? Well, I say that they involve the illusory the illusory introspective representation of phenomenal properties. They don't involve actual phenomenal properties. Now, if that's compatible with realism, then I'm a realist and everybody's happy. But I certainly deny that phenomenal properties, understood as sort of non-functional qualitative properties that can be that are conceptually, possibly metaphysically distinct from the physical functional ones, no, I deny they exist. I think what's distinct about those episodes is that they involve the representation of those properties, and that we can't go beyond our representations.
Right. This is really what's hard about this discussion, because everything you just said, I of course agree with, but interpret completely differently. So it's hard to make any progress here, because there's nothing that you said that I could object to except all of it.
I represent myself as having, my mental states, if I introspectively represent them as having phenomenal properties, then that's it. I can't get outside those representations and check to see if there really are phenomenal properties there.
Right, unless that is what phenomenal properties are, which is what I've been arguing.
They're merely the intentional objects.
No, they're the state which has those intentional objects.
Well, again, I'm not sure.
This is I think what's been going on in our discussion this whole time, is that it's seeming to me that there's an assumption in the way you set the problem up, which assumes a first order theory must be right. So the assumption is that if there were phenomenal properties, they would have to be at the first order level, and they would have to be this kind of special property that's weird, and we'd have to have some direct access to it. And if all of those things were true, then realism would be true. And what I'm questioning is like every part of that as part of the package of realism. So I don't think that to be a realist about consciousness, you have to be committed to there being phenomenal properties at the first order level. You're committed to there being something that is like for you. And then the way that it's like for you is going to involve attributing properties to you of a certain kind. But it's not at that level obvious whether it's first or second or third or 100th level. It's just that there's something like that it's like for me. There are some states that explain it. Where are those states? Which ones do the work?
I think it's if phenomenal consciousness is whatever explains our disposition to say that it's like something for me, then yeah, I'm okay with that.
Right. No, I know, but see how you snuck in the disposition. Phenomenal consciousness is whatever explains that there is something that is like for me.
That's where, because then if there is something that's like me, if we're going to start, if there are, properties here, what it is, because we go from it's like something to there is a what it is likeness, a property. Now, if there is some kind of property there, then I'm committed to this, that if it is anything at all for me, then I need to be representing it in some way.
Yes.
So if these higher
but even
order
Chalmers says that. I mean, even that's like very weak.
And it doesn't matter whether the representation is veridical or non-veridical, because I'm just live within my representations and I have no way of checking them in this case because they're introspective.
Right.
So if the idea is that that the phenomenal property is just represented by the higher order representation, And yeah, I'm with you totally. If the idea is that the phenomenal property is possessed by the higher order representation, then I'm not, because then I want to know how I'm aware of it. If it's
Well,
not
you'd be aware of it the same way you're aware of anything, by having a further higher
yeah, well,
order.
exactly. Yeah, well, yeah, that's fine. So then, but then I would need to have that if the phenomenal property is a property of the higher order representation, then I need another representation to be aware of that to be phenomenally conscious. So the higher order representation itself isn't doing it.
Yeah, see, I see what you're saying, but what I would want to qualify that the representation is the phenomenal property. Doesn't possess it. It isn't. There's a difference. H2O doesn't possess water. It is water. That's what it is.
Yeah, well, I'm not aware of water unless I have some representation of it. So if the higher order representation is the phenomenal property, then I need to have some further representation of it.
That's right. But why can't you have phenomenal properties that you're not aware of having?
Because if I'm not aware of something, if I don't represent it, it's nothing for me. It's not like anything.
It is. If what you're representing is that you have a certain state. That's what it is for there to be something.
I think the state that I'm representing myself as having is something for me, but the representing state itself and its properties are not like anything for me unless they're represented. If the phenomenal consciousness is part of the content of the state, then that's like something. Yeah. If it's a property of the representing state, then it's not, unless that is itself represented.
I mean, I think we're just going around kind of the horn here, because I would deny that the state being represented is the one that's phenomenally conscious. That's kind of what I think is the whole problem. I'm working on a paper with Jake Berger about this kind of issue, something that we call, well, anyway, I don't want to get to it, but anyway, we think that a lot of people make this kind of assumption that there's got to be some actually existing first order state that has some kind of property. That's what, if anything, phenomenal consciousness would be. And that's seeming to me already loading in way more than you need. And in fact, it's putting on more cargo than the boat can carry. And so you're going to sink the physicalist ship if you do that. But that's not the only way. That's a really tendentious way of setting up the debate, I would say.
What sinks the ship is the idea that there's any state that has a phenomenal property.
Yeah. See, I don't know.
What you need to float the ship is the idea that phenomenal properties are merely intentional objects. Because intentional objects are nice and cheap.
It depends on what you think. I don't think that. So it depends on what you think about that. So if you're someone who thinks that non-existent objects can have properties, then I don't understand what you're saying. Really,
they're cheap. They're cheap in the sense that we need them for all sorts of other purposes as well. They don't generate a unique problem of consciousness. So
but they do generate the unique problem of intentionality, which is
Oh yes, absolutely.
More intractable.
But yes, absolutely. But yeah, as I say, I think probably I'm just going to end up going over the same.
Well, I'll share this paper with you because I think this is something. I think the crux of this issue is really important. But I notice we're running out of time here, and I wanted to ask you. I don't want to just abruptly change the topic, but let me abruptly change the topic. I wanted to ask you about some of your arguments against other theories. So you've said panpsychism is hopeless, and I wanted to just kind of ask you about that. So I'm not a panpsychist, obviously, but I'm not against it. I think of the views that are out there, it's generating the kind of excitement that it is because it threatens to allow physicalists to have what they've always wanted, which is some kind of causal interaction for consciousness, while at the same time allowing dualists whatever they wanted, which was to say that these things just simply aren't physical properties as we currently understand them. So that's why I think where the excitement of the view originates and why I would be interested in exploring it. But what do you think? Why is it not going to help us solve the problem of consciousness?
In some ways, I have some sympathy with panpsychism. I think if you're a realist, you take the realist intuition seriously, then it's a fairly natural place to end up, because you don't end up with these nomological danglers, That's Smart's phrase, isn't it? You don't have these kind of sort of apparently ad hoc identities between rather very complex physical states and simple phenomenal states. You put it right there in at the foundations, and it's a kind of neat picture. I mean, you have this incredibly intractable problem of how these things combine to form complex consciousnesses. And also you have the horrible problem of what a subject is on this. I mean, what exactly is a subject? I mean, insofar as I've got much grip on the subject, it's the kind of thing that we are, in virtue of all sorts of abilities that we have, and the way that we conceptualize ourselves and so on. The idea that an atom or an electron or quark or whatever might be a subject, I really can't make much sense of that. I think that's actually the big problem for realism generally, is not so much the properties, it's the subject that is aware of them that creates them. So I mean, what it does is it's a way of vindicating the realist intuition with minimal disruption to the physical system.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have all your nice physical laws doing all the physical stuff, and all those explanations go through, but you manage to pack in phenomenal consciousness at in a very innocuous location. And the beauty of this innocuous location is that it also kind of seems to be doing a bit of the physical, of the causal work, although it's not making any distinctive physical contribution. Everything would carry on just the same in virtue of the structure and dynamics without it. So it's kind of a really clever idea that we have this realist intuition about ourselves, and we need to find a place for consciousness in the physical world. Finding it just in brains, it seems a bit kind of arbitrary that certain pattern of firing or whatever should be conscious, but maybe it's right down there so it's fundamental, and it doesn't really make any difference. So it's a really elegant sort of solution if you want to vindicate that intuition. And in a way, I'm inclined to say, well, since it doesn't have any, it's no actual interaction, there's no changes to it doesn't have any effects on what scientists should be doing. Scientists could just sort of endorse it as a way of quelling their intuition, and then just get on with the real work. Or the only thing to be done in that project is just to sort of articulate the position in as elegant a way as you can, in an entirely philosophical level. There's no scientific work to be done. It's got no implications for the science of consciousness, I see. So if you really want your intuition, and you really want to sort of insulate it from any practical problems, I'm going to go with it. But I think it's just a complete fifth wheel. It's doing nothing except vindicating an intuition, and an intuition, of course, which is very, very peculiar to us and to our situation, and which is a feature of human psychology, possibly of all suitably advanced reflective kinds of intelligences, but I think which is a very interesting feature of our psychology, that we have this intuition, the zombic hunch, as Dennett calls it, this intuition that there is this ineffable inner world. That's a fascinating feature of human psychology, and which generates the meta problem, the problem of explaining that intuition, and that's really, really interesting. Now, if you insist on saying, and that intuition has to be, it's true, damn it, and I need to underwrite that metaphysically, fine. You go on.
Fine.
With that.
So I'll sign you up for panpsychism
then. No, please. But in a way, it is the mirror image of illusionism, because I think what both are reacting to is a sense that, particularly the phenomenal concept strategy, is that the prospects for physicalist realism are not as good as they seem to be. At least that's what's driving the people who take these routes, and that the phenomenal concept strategy has not got the resources to do this. And once that breaks down, then it really becomes, you've got a kind of choice, and you can say, okay, these things are nowhere, or these things are everywhere. But the idea that they're just in certain brains or parts of brains seems hard to. So I think they're a reaction to they're both different reactions to a similar trend. The recognition of the problems for
traditional physicalism,
for physicalist realism, conservative realism.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, do you So it sounds like you're saying that basically, if you have a certain set of intuitions that you can't escape,
Mhm.
and you don't want to do violence to our beautiful physical science, then you could cost-free accept panpsychism, but it's not that interesting because all the real work is going to be done by the things which are not the panpsychist stuff.
I see it a bit. I suppose it's a bit like my reaction to certain religions. You know, if it gets you through the night, fine.
Right.
Realistically, but you know, if this really worries you, you know, because at least you won't do any harm.
Right. At least you won't do any harm.
You might do some actual harm here. I mean, the thing is, what's lovely about panpsychism is it solves this where the problem of the correlates of consciousness beautifully. Where are the correlates of consciousness? Everywhere.
Yeah. They're not neural, but there still would be a question about neural correlates, I think, even if you're a panpsychist.
Yeah, but that's the combination problem, and then you know that's just completely intractable. When do these things, you know, which particular collection of these micro consciousnesses is my consciousness? Does it involve? Are my glasses part of it? Is my hair part of it? Is my amygdala part of it? Is it just my cerebral my sensory core? Oh, it's unanswerable. Completely
really hard. I think it's interesting too because you know I talked to Philip Goff recently. He's a panpsychist. And he basically said that if, you know, he was ever convinced that panpsychism was false, he'd become an illusionist. And so it sounds like you're saying that if panpsychism is the mirror of illusionism. And so I see that you guys, that's part of what I was saying earlier was that it seems like you have a similar kind of set of assumptions as your opponent. In this case, it's just that you do the modus tollens and they do the modus ponens. And it's the whole set of assumptions which I'm worried about that you guys share. So I think that's interesting. But let's not get distracted back to that. What I wanted to ask was, and it's a bit unfair for me to say that and then I'll let you respond. So go ahead. Do you have something you want to say about what I said that we don't want to get back into?
Okay. I mean, I probably would, but I'm not. That's not. Silence isn't an endorsement necessarily. But,
okay. So, do you disagree with the panpsychist or Russellian monist in their claim about what physical science tells us? So their claim is that physical science, physics especially, tells us only about the behavioral profiles of electrons, but doesn't tell us what electrons really are. So do you agree with that, or that first step they make, or not?
My sense is that when I talk to physicists about this, they're just kind of bewildered by this insistence on there being some kind of intrinsic properties. I think they say, if I try and explain this, they say, well, you're thinking about these things as if they were like sort of like a football, and we can ask what color it is and then what it's made of. But it's not like that at all. You need to when you do the physics, you're just not talking in terms of kind of objects with properties, with intrinsic properties and relational properties. You've just way gone beyond that. Right. You're into another sort of level of description altogether. And so, I mean, it's for you need to talk to a physicist about whether that's but my sense is that it's projecting a kind of sort of the distinction between intrinsic and relational properties is kind of feature of our manifest image, as it were, and just projecting it down there on the kind of image that physicists develop, which is a very, very counterintuitive picture, is a dodgy way to go. And I've not found many physicists who go, yeah, we've really been wondering about those intrinsic properties all this time, and we've done it, and that's been really bothering us. It's never occurred to them that that's
what about this famous? I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but in defense of these, I don't want to subtweet any panpsychist. Can you subtweet someone in a video? I don't know. But anyway, to kind of try to be fair to the people who aren't here to defend themselves. What do you? So some people point to like the famous quote from Stephen Hawking. You know, what puts fire into the equations? And so some people have interpreted things like that as like asking, what are the intrinsic properties here? Do you not think that's the right way of interpreting that, or?
I mean, okay, it's. I really don't know. I'm not a physicist. I need to be. I think unless you're actually really, really deep into the conceptual world of fundamental physics, I don't think my intuitions are worth kind of nothing. but even though we do need something to breathe fire into them, I think it seems to me a little hubristic to think that it's kind of my mind, the stuff that's in my mind that does it. What could be breathing fire into the universe? This stuff that's in my head. I mean, it's like, just imagine if this is an example. Imagine we've got this alien species that have never developed phenomenal consciousness or whatever, but they do really good physics, and so they've got amazing physics. But they've always been puzzled about this fundamental thing, and eventually they find us, and they say, "Here it is. These guys have got the insight into the universe, into the fundamental structure of the universe that we were lacking."
Uh-oh. What happened? Looks like the call was dropped. See if I can get him back here. Or maybe that was the end. He's back.
Sorry.
You're back.
Something happened.
Did you say all the important bits when you went off?
My aliens who do physics but don't have phenomenal consciousness, and we have the secret that they were missing it. I mean, that's just but if you really think that's worrying, then how about illusionist panpsychism, where phenomenal properties aren't real; they're merely intentional objects of our introspective representations. They're not actual properties of our minds, brains, but these illusory properties that we misrepresent ourselves as having are the actual fundamental properties. So only the micro particles are conscious. So if you really want to have that, it may be our introspective.
Yeah, we're zombies, but the particles are not.
If you really want to have, insofar as it's a demand for intrinsic properties, absolutely intrinsic properties, that's compatible with illusionism.
Yeah. I mean, so just to try to connect back up before we drop the call for a second. So, you were saying that physicists don't really seem to care about the intrinsic versus relational distinction. And I think that's obviously true because they don't care about metaphysics. They care about science. So isn't there still a distinction here that they should worry about? Like telling me electrons, mass resists acceleration and electrons repel other electrons or whatever. There still does seem to be a question about what the electron really is that physicists don't seem to care about. What they care about describing the interactions and predicting interactions between this and that, and what can we see over there if we put this that way at a very, that's what they care about. But isn't there still a perfectly good question that maybe they don't care about, but that's still perfectly good, which is there an intrinsic nature? Seems like, sorry, go ahead.
There's certainly a question which it seems the common sense one to ask. But I'm worried that seems like a common sense one because it's a question that we can ask about the ordinary, everyday sized objects that we have around us.
I see.
And so the cup has certain colors and the shape and so on, and it's what's it actually made of? Yes, that's so. Let now project that down back into the fundamental world of fundamental physics, and I don't know whether it's still a good question.
Right. No, that's an excellent point. Yeah.
I'm inclined to think that what's a good question are the questions that are forced upon you by doing fundamental physics.
And that question's not forced on you.
That occur to you when you try to view fundamental physics through the lens of our kind of everyday manifest image of the world.
Yeah.
And that's why I suppose I'm a pragmatist in some way. We what do we need these concepts for? What is it doing for us? I've no sense. I mean, it is actually curious, I think, because one thing that panpsychists and consciousness realists tend to say is that they tend to accuse physicalists of having a sort of two old-fashioned view of the fundamental physics. You know, there's just like billiard balls knocking into each other. Well, I don't know. But then they say, but anyway, these billiard balls that
Yeah, exactly.
I don't really believe it. They must be made of something, right?
Exactly.
So hang on, I thought you were the guys who said it was all weird, weird shit down there. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I agree.
So I'm being a bit unfair there, but we're late in the interview, and
yeah, exactly.
I let my hair down. And
no one will watch it this far. You can say whatever you want. No, I'm kidding. I'll clip it out later, and people will see it. But I agree with you. I mean, I do think that there's maybe a hangover of classical Newtonian physics in a lot of people's thinking. That's a different topic, but it is interesting. 100 years of quantum mechanics, and still hasn't penetrated quite to the level of even relativity theory, which I think is a little more widely commonsensically. But we talk to the average undergraduate, and they're still like they're ready to fight you over it. So it's still not seeped into the common mindset. They've heard of relativity theory. They don't know really what it entails. But anyway, so I'm sympathetic to the things that you were just saying. I mean, because panpsychism for me, I agree that really what you're trying to do is vindicate an intuition, and it does seem sort of a lot of work to do to vindicate an intuition, and that's what I've always thought is interesting about non-physical views, non-physicalism in general, is that all of the evidence for it depends on these kind of intuition pumps or conceivability. There's no empirical evidence to speak of for non-physicalism. And I've talked, maybe some people like Adam Pout says, yeah, well, the evidence is that all physical theories fail. So it's not that maybe there's some other stuff to talk about here, but a surprising amount of it is like, we couldn't possibly be wrong about this. And that is a weird place to hang your hat, given the history of what we've found out, that we suck at all of this stuff mostly. And that's a general limit of its argument, right? That, why would this be the one place where we got everything right? Why?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it seems to me that, the positions I have are really at least the possibility of the positions that I have, the fact that we should be open to these positions, is just a consequence of treating us naturalistically. We're part of the natural world, and we don't know anything with certainty about ourselves. Well, but maybe we do. It depends what you mean by that. We don't have any infallible knowledge about ourselves,
right?
No matter how much it seems that we do, including our own minds. That what we know is what we're inclined to say and report and tell ourselves, and so. But beyond that, what's producing it? I mean, yes, we have this sense that there's this absolute fundamental reality that can't be doubted away. But I'm inclined to think that the only thing that can't be doubted away is something very, very thin and indexical, like this is happening, where it's where this doesn't latch onto anything specific.
Yeah, and that just to kind of bring this back full circle, I would also say that the sortals which are attached to this are going to be. I mean, part of my worry here is that we will employ different sortals, and that's going to affect the way you theorize. So that I've never, as far as I know, ever employed any kind of sortal like non-physical. That seems very weird to me to introspect and say, oh, there's a non-physical thing. So if you think that that's part of like what the way we're describing to ourselves what we're finding, then that's worrying to me, because I don't find that. And that may be part of the problem here, is that the way we conceptualize the things that we find bias us in certain ways. And that's a worry that I don't think enough people have paid attention to. Like
there must be a lot of implicit sortals just to get the intuition pumps working. It seems that
but they're all about epistemic properties, not about metaphysical properties.
Well, yeah, supposedly, yeah.
Yes. But I would want to defend that. I mean, I would defend that claim. So let's suppose it or attack it.
I mean, we all know that it really does take. There's a whole sort of. How does this all get going? It gets going with a bunch of thought experiments, a bunch of information about the nature of perception and about what science tells us about the nature of color, and then a bunch of thought experiments about inverted spectra and after images and all this. We all have to do this when we teach philosophy of mind 101. We trot people through this. The banana, maybe the banana looks blue to me. We trot it with it. We make this distinction between worldly colors and mental colors, and we do this every time. And we are, we're just priming the pump up for all these intuitions, and then we start pumping the handle, and yes, they get these intuitions, and then we need these problems of content. This is kind of why I'm Dan in his comment on the illusionism volume, in his paper, the illusionist should be the obvious default theory. I'm inclined to think that. Let's sort of, because we certainly need to solve the meta problem. Everyone agrees on that, and I think horror theory is a pretty good candidate for solving it. Let's do that. Let's develop that. Let's and obviously what we have at the moment are just the bare bones of theories. Let's flesh these out. Let's get them integrated with the neuroscience. Let's get them really tested, and then where does that leave us? Do we still feel this great sort of explanatory hole?
Right.
Or so I can see that where you are sort of epistemically, at the moment, your good Richard and bad Richard, or whichever one is which, are both sort of in a similar epistemic position. But maybe in 20, 30 years' time, I don't know. Maybe the realist one that's still going to be saying, no, look, I'm still not satisfied. There's still big problems here. But let's do the work on the one that we can actually, that actually offers a constructive program.
Right. But so that's the meta problem you're saying. Let's do the work on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I call it the illusion problem because I don't think there is a first order problem.
Right.
There is just the illusion problem. But by calling it the meta problem, Dave has done us a service because he's turned it into a problem that everyone can address, everyone can acknowledge. I mean, except for the real type A people, I don't think there is a meta problem. Oh no, there's a meta problem. The meta problem is the problem of there isn't a meta problem. There's the illusion problem, the problem of explaining the heterophenomenology. That's essentially what the meta problem is. It's only a meta problem if you think there's, that's the term. I don't agree with the term, but the problem is the problem of explaining the reports and reactions, the judgments and so on. So let's work on that and then see where we get. And meantime, we could all be sort of, if you really have these doubts, you can go into, in privacy, you can be a panpsychist
but so there's a lot I want to ask you about that, but I've been noticing some as we've been talking the chat comments over here.
Oh, great.
So I wonder if let's see, I have a question here from Shane Wagoner. They say they just read your Quining Diet Qualia, and they'd be curious to know whether you are still worried about the possibility of a theory-neutral dialogue with anti-physicists. So there is no theory-neutral dialogue on your view, is there?
So I didn't catch the end of the question, whether I think there's a theory-neutral...
are you still worried about the possibility for theory-neutral dialogue with anti-physicalists?
Yes, I think that's the problem. I think that everyone agrees now that the notion of qualia in the classic sense is a theoretically loaded notion, and so the standard, then it pretty much, put an arrow through the heart of that. Yeah. And so the standard move is then we say, okay, let's strip away the theoretical commitments, but there's still the what it is likeness, the stuff that that quote from Louis Armstrong or whatever it is. There's still that there, of course, but we'll strip away the intrinsicness, the ineffability and all this other stuff. Yeah, I don't know what's left. I don't think anything's left. I think what you end up explaining simply is the heterophenomenology, the reports, the judgments, and so on. And then you say, okay, I've identified something that can explain all of those, which is just explaining what I call zero qualia, the heterophenomenology, and that also explains phenomenality itself. That's the same. It's the same thing. It's that second step. No, once you've stripped away all that other stuff, I don't think you've any coherent notion, except you're just gesturing at whatever it is that explains the heterophenomenology.
So how can you engage in a debate with anti-physicalist then. It doesn't sound
the
like
way
there's nowhere for you to stand in the common
that's,
ground.
that's the way that in exactly the way that Dennett has been doing over the years. I mean, people sometimes criticize Dennett by saying that he doesn't actually sort of present kind of like bullet pointed arguments.
Yes.
He's not. He's trying to get you to look at it a different way. He's trying to say, look at it. It's a matter of changing your perspective on this and seeing the theoretical advantages of just starting from a different point.
So there's no rational persuasion here. Then there's got to be some other.
There is, but it's holistic. It's if you look at it from this point of view, then a lot of things that were previously looked intractable and puzzling and led you down all sorts of strange and tortuous alleys, those things just no longer seem to be a problem, and we get a lot of fruitful insights into a lot of other stuff, and it meshes nicely with the science and so on. So it's not an argument from first principles, but it's an argument from reorganize your web of belief in this way, and things go a lot more smoothly. So
so I wonder if there is, kind of to echo some things from Descartes in the beginning of our discussion. So some people would interpret Descartes' undoubtability as a psychological inability to imagine the thing in question. So I wonder if there's some kind of similar problem here, because I don't see how people can reimagine their web of belief so that they exclude the thing which is most obvious to them, which is that there's conscious experience. So there's no way. I don't think you can really believe that you're a zombie. I don't think that's possible.
I think there are ways of reconceptualizing. I mean, look, reconceptualizing what it is that you're picking out. That when you're seeing, I mean, this is the task is to build a sort of two-level. There's a sort of two strategy. One is to dismantle this bad image, and then one is to build up from the subpersonal level a story of what is going on that sort of fills in the gap that has been left by dismantling that image, so that you don't feel that anything. So you need to reconceptualize what's happening. I mean, at a personal level, you can still keep on living within that illusion, as it were. That's kind of your sort of, certainly. I mean, Dennett's happy to say that colors and things as properties of the external world are real. They're properties of your manifest image. They're things you're sensitive to, and their character is due to the way they the sort of affordances they offer. I mean, color seems kind of arbitrary to us, but presumably it has all sorts of evolved purposes. That it's highlighting us to differences out there that make a difference for us, that are salient, and it's the saliency of these differences that we think of as the distinctiveness of each color. So you live in a world which is, as it were, populated by things that are kind of pulling you in different directions, that are affording you all kinds of different reactions, which pain is an obvious kind of, it's something. It's not something that you're just kind of passively aware of. It's something that pulls you. It's an aspect of the world that grabs your attention and pulls you in a certain way. Okay, and it's a part of the world, not a part of your mind. It's a part of the world as your mind presents it to you in the manifest image, and that's where you're living, in this manifest image, in a world of things which afford you all kinds of stuff. Now it's reconceptualizing this notion of pure qualitative stuff in terms of affordances. I think that starts to get you somewhere. So instead of thinking of the pure feel abstractly, think of what it's doing to you. It's an interaction between you and the world. The world is grabbing you and pulling you around, and that's the feel. It's not a passive show inside your head. That's how I want to think about it, putting us out into the world.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like the real foe is the one that's always been on Dennett's radar, which is the Cartesian theater.
Yes.
But you don't have to be an illusionist to get rid of the Cartesian theater.
This is kind of another thing that we could talk about for another hour or so, but I do think, insofar as things that you're not aware of are nothing for you. So if there are qualia, you have to be aware of them. So there has to be some sort of at least functional location where this awareness happens. If they're just there in my head without any sort of observation of them, then I don't see how they're anything for me, any more than the carbon atoms that are in my head are anything for me. So so my point was that I would try to sort of build up this alternative picture of these things as very active features of my manifest image.
Right.
It's a kind of living in a kind of constructed world, which is a world in which is a sort of a representation of the external world as meaningful for me. And it's this meaningfulness that is what we're kind of gesturing at when we talk about the field.
This is what I would call the good Keith.
It's not a realist Keith.
It sounds like a realist Keith to me. I mean, I don't see the distinction at that point.
Because it's rejecting the notion of phenomenality that as some properties, introspectable properties of brain states that are actually, that's what I'm rejecting. This is why I don't think illusionism should.
But it makes it sound like naive realists can't believe in phenomenal consciousness, but they do. So that can't be right.
I'd have to think about that one. I'd have to think about that more. I'm denying the conception of consciousness that generates all the intuition, the sort of stuff that zombies could lack. Zombies would have exactly the same all this engagement that I was talking about with the affordances in the world. They would have all of that, and we'd know that they would have all of that because we know what's happening in the world.
Yeah, and that might be a good place for us to sort of wrap up, because I'm noticing it's almost 7 and I do have to go. I mean, I don't know what time your time, but I have to go teach a class after this.
We've been talking for 2 hours, gosh.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm going to be using this video in my class because we're actually reading your paper on illusionism in my consciousness class this semester. So it's coming up after the spring break, actually. So I think this video will be useful because a lot of people, what I find is that they, first of all, don't understand the view. They think that's where a lot of the knee-jerk reactions come from. It's silly, and the Trotskys of the world say those sorts of things. So they're reacting to the way Dennett presents it in a very airy, breezy way. But the way you present it is more, I mean, I prefer your presentation to Dennett's, to be honest, because it's more focused on arguments and less on reorienting the picture in a narrative way. So maybe they're both different, they serve different purposes, I don't know, but I like yours better. And I actually think you've done a great service to the field by taking up this and arguing for it seriously. So I even though I don't agree with you, I think it's important that there are people like you who are doing what you're doing. So,
thank you.
And taking it on the chin too, and being upfront about it, and not trying to be a weasel, and that's commendable.
I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I really love what Good Richard is doing. So,
okay, it's a love fest. But to bring it back to a less love festy area, I was going to talk about zombies, because I agree with you that zombies wouldn't lack anything that we have, but that's because I think they're impossible and they can't even be conceived coherently. And the reason, I mean, I know this is an area where, we agree, and you came up with your anti-zombies before I thought of zombies, and then I found out afterwards. And it was sort of disappointing. It was one of those moments where I was like, fuck, there really is nothing new under the sun. Everything's been thought of, Jesus. But okay, but it's still a good argument, right? And even if you were smarter and thought of it first, it's still an important argument that needs to be talked about. But what's confused me all these years since then is whether we're really talking about the same thing. So anti-zombies and zombies, do they pick out the same hypothetical creatures? And I think not. I don't think they do. So I wonder, first of all, just for people who don't know what an anti-zombie is, can you just walk us through what your account of that is? I mean, assuming you have time to do this, because it's late.
No, sure. I know. Yeah. It's going back a bit, and that was a different me. Obviously, the anti-zombie argument can be used to support type B materialism. In fact, that looks like its primary function. And I'm not a type B materialist, and I'm inclined now to say that depending on what concept of consciousness we use, I think that anti-zombies aren't conceivable, and so that the argument becomes a modus tollens, I guess.
Wait, so, you said anti-zombies are not conceivable?
I'm inclined to think they're not now, yes. Depending on what you mean by consciousness. Depending on what sort of concept of consciousness we use.
See, this is why I think we disagree. This is what I was trying to get at, because zombies are the things that have that thing you don't want.
So what an anti-zombie is supposed to be? I mean, well, I think maybe we do have the same thing in mind. What an anti-zombie is simply supposed to be an atom for atom physical duplicate living in a world that is a physical duplicate of ours, simpliciter. but which are conscious. So
does the simpliciter part rule out things like blockers and all those other weird things that people dealing with this stuff have talked about?
Long time since I thought about this, but I think so. I think I want to say so. That yes, that it's a yes. I think so. I'd need to go back and think about it, but I think that's the idea. They are conscious in virtue of their physical constitution.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what we want to say. And so the idea is that there's no inconsistency in imagining a creature that is conscious in virtue of its physical constitution. That was the claim. And then I think you get everything that, and I think that's what a Shambi is, right? Without all the qualifications, I think.
Well, depending on what concept of consciousness. I think that's what's going to distinguish them.
If we're just using consciousness in the everyday sense of whatever it is that's happening when I look at the sky out there, then I think that's absolutely right. If we're using it in this, what I do think is a theoretically loaded sense, the what it is like, the sense, and so on, then I don't know, because at any rate, I wouldn't be. I would still have explanatory worries. I mean, it's more the explanatory worries that bother me rather than the possibility of a sort of type B, the coherence of a type B physicalism. I wouldn't be happy just stopping at type B physicalism, even if that was metaphysically okay. I'm sort of a priori physicalist.
Yes. Okay. Because I mean, this is what I've always thought. When people. When it came out that there was already, your paper was first, people asked me, like Chalmers actually asked me, he was like, why are you still using the word Shambi? Why don't you just use the word anti-zombie? It's already established. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a good point. You don't want to make up new words for things that already exist, and just because you can. But it seemed to me that there was really a reason to distinguish the two. So as you say, a Shambi is my version of a physical duplicate of you living in a physical world, so that's conscious in virtue of its physical nature. Mm-hmm. Except for that, the kind of consciousness that it has is the kind that Chalmers says is real. So that's what a Shambi is, according to me. It's that you take the thing that Strawson says, that thing is physical at the Shambi world, and that's not what you mean by an anti-zombie.
That was what I meant when I wrote the paper. That's what I was in the context of Frankish 2005 or whenever that paper was. That's what I meant, and the idea was that this was a mirror of the zombie argument, and it meant that considerations of conceivability, and that's what the final line is of the paper, and it shows that considerations of conceivability have little relevance to settling the metaphysics of this. That was what the paper was trying to do, and I wrote the first draft a long time ago, when I guess I was I don't think I ever pinned my colours really to the type B mass, but I think that's what I was. I was pretty much in that tradition. I was what I call a conservative realist. So yes, that's the Frankish who wrote that paper was. But if you ask now, do I and I argued in the paper that anti-zombies were conceivable. Now I would say no, they're not in that sense. But anti-zombies in a weaker sense are.
Yeah, so I would want to use the term Shambi for the stronger sense, and I think that they are conceivable. So I wonder why you have changed your mind on that.
Largely, I think it's mainly explanatory worries. I'm just not happy with having some sort of metaphysics where everything's physical.
But conceivability doesn't hang on what makes you happy. It hangs on what entails a contradiction. So what contradiction is entailed by the claim?
I just want to see. I just want there to be no explanatory gap. I want to, and it seems that in the end, considerations of conceivability are what close explanatory gaps. If it's not conceivable that there could be that stuff without that stuff, then that's what closes the gap. So that's how conceivability comes in, isn't it? It's you don't have a satisfying explanation until until the mechanism becomes intelligible to you.
Right. So, I mean, and this is a difference in the way you ran the argument and the way I ran it. So you wanted to run the argument which suggests that conceivability doesn't have much to do with possibility, whereas I wanted to run the argument as showing that, well, zombies aren't even conceivable. So it's not even the possibility claim that I care about, because I actually, in some of my moods, would accept that conceivability possibility link. In my type B moods, I'm in my other moods, I'm like, yeah, that's the normal way things work. So
that's another way you could use the argument. Yes, if you're.
But it won't only work if you do it my way. It won't work if you do it your way, because if what you're conceiving of is not really conscious, then you're just conceiving of the zombie world and playing into the opponent's hands.
Look, no, I'm going to look. The term anti-zombie was coined by someone who was using consciousness in your sense. Okay, so I'm happy to leave the concept of the anti-zombie in that realist world. Okay, so I was using the concept there of consciousness, the realist concept that you have.
But by your own admission, it doesn't work anymore.
No, well, the arguments work. It depends whether the premises are true.
Exactly.
The arguments perfectly valid, and that's the whole point. That there's a parallel argument, and then the question is which. I mean, there's two ways of responding to the parallelism. One is to say that that the link between conceivability and possibility doesn't work. So it could be the first premises of both of them, the conceivability, the zombies are conceivable, anti-zombies are conceivable, they're both true, and you deal with the contradiction between the conclusions by denying the second premise about the link between conceivability and possibility. The other is to say, well, no, the link between conceivability and possibility is sound, and one of the first premises must be rejected. Now, when I wrote the paper, I thought that I then did accept the conceivability, the CP thesis, the conceivability possibility, and I was inclined to say that this showed that either that zombies weren't conceivable, or that no, sorry, I should have said I was ambivalent about the CP thesis, and I was inclined to draw the conclusion either that zombies aren't conceivable or that the CP thesis is false. Right, and I said either way, the zombie argument itself isn't going to establish antiphysicalism. That's how it went. Yeah. So whether you reject the conceivability, because I was relying on the conceivability of physicalism as a premise. Now I'm more inclined now to hold on to the CP thesis, partly because I just want it for explanatory purposes, and deny the conceivability of anti-zombies.
But then so by doing that, you have admitted the conceivability of zombies. So if you accept the CP thesis, one of them has to be. So.
Yes, I think. Hang on. Yes, I'm just certainly. I accept the conceivability of zombies
and then the possibility
with that sense of consciousness that we were using then, in that realist sense of consciousness. Yes, I absolutely accept the conceivability. I think we are zombies in that sense. I don't think they're really conceivable. I think they're actual.
So you think so? I mean, the issues here are so difficult. We've already been going so long. I mean, it's about to be another 3-hour conversation. So I think we're gonna have to schedule a round 3 of this game, I think. But so it seems to me that you. So here's the way I would interpret what you just said, and tell me if I'm being unfair. So what I heard you just say was that, yes, the arguments from two-dimensional, the two-dimensional argument from Chalmers does falsify a kind of physicalism, namely the kind which you call consciousness realism. Yeah. That's what you just said.
It's pretty close to it, at least. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm inclined to say that if we're realists in that sense, then we can't be physicalists. Yes, I'm inclined to say that.
Yeah, I guess, and so that was the whole point of zombies for me, or anti-zombies. I still want to resist calling them anti-zombies because I don't think you really have. I don't think anti-zombies. I think anti-zombies are zombies. Actually, is what I think. But I think zombies are not.
No.
A zombie is a conceivable creature. I mean, I don't see any reason that it's not conceivable, and except for being unhappy, that doesn't move me. I want an entailed contradiction. A physical creature that's conscious in the way that Chalmers thinks consciousness is, the way I think it is a conceivable thing. There's no contradiction there. Zombies, there's no contradiction there. One of them has to be contradictory if you accept the CP thesis.
Well, look, I mean, positive and negative conceivability. I certainly.
I'm talking about negative.
Yeah, I know. I'm inclined to think. Well, I don't know. I'm inclined, if and this is going into another area altogether, to think that there are incoherences in the concept of phenomenal consciousness of the sort that Dennett keeps driving at. So it's certainly not conceivable if they're actually incoherences in the inconsistencies in the very way that the situation is described. And I certainly don't think it's positively conceivable, and that is supposed to be the best kind of conceivability for these kind of arguments. Is there's a whole there's a posterior, or careful and distinct. Positive.
Chalmers says the zombie argument relies only on negative conceivability. Positive conceivability is harder, but even there, I think you can do it. I mean, that's what the higher order theory, and that's what Bloch's theory. I mean, Bloch is positively conceiving of how consciousness can be physical. He's not stupid. He's conceiving of something. There's no obvious contradiction there. If Bloch's theory was right, if the world turned out that way, boom, done.
This was exactly how I thought when I was writing the anti-zombie. Anti-zombies were meant to be zombies in zombies in that sense. And I thought that I couldn't. It was just this. This is a physical DWB, and in virtue of its physical constitution, it has this whole rich, phenomenal, whatever it is. That was the idea.
Yeah.
And so I mean, if anti-zombies were merely anti-zombies in the illusionist sort of sense, then they'd be rather uninteresting creatures. And so I was meaning it to do the kind of work that that I think we both wanted it to do pretty much the same work. I'm just now feel that work is less worth doing, partly because I have all these explanatory worries. And I mean, okay, look, I mean, it all turns on the different notions of conceivability. Okay, let's say they're conceivable, and so let's say that they're metaphysically possible. So type B physicalism is an option.
Yeah.
Okay, I still don't think it's an attractive option because I have all these explanatory worries. So
but you could also have the type A version of it, because I think that's also conceivable.
Now, I certainly don't think that's positively conceivable. And as I said, I'd probably then start, if I wanted to argue about that, I would probably then start getting into questions about the coherence of the notion, and start doing the sort of the things like the way that that Dennett uses things like change blindness and the wonderful Mr. Clapgrass. Do you remember from Sweet Dreams? And I'd start doing these things which kind of try to pick apart the coherence of the content. What's happened to Mr. Clapgrass? How he still reliably detects or classifies all the colors, yet they all kind of, and he still says that's yellow, but it's kind of doesn't feel like yellow anymore. It feels like like blue, and everything's emotionally inverted, as it were, associatively inverted, but still kind of in a sense looks the same. Or the pain where pain no longer bothers you, and this kind of stuff. And what this is, this kind of try and pick it apart in that way.
Well, there's no incoherency in any of that stuff. There's just a class with pre-theoretic intuitions, but that's not incoherency. That's
well, I don't know. I think our concept of the phenomenal is that these sort of things shouldn't happen, as it were. With the coffee taste, these things there should be distinct alternatives here.
And there are. It's just, I mean, then it's a verificationist, and we can't test for the differences. But if you have a theory, like, take not to turn this into higher order theory time, but if you have a theory like a higher order theory, there's a perfectly good account for the difference between Chase and Sanborn. It has to do with what first order states there, what higher order states are there, and what it's like to be them.
And then it would quite agree that there's a distinction you could make there.
Yeah.
You would say that it's not a distinction between the facts of phenomenal consciousness, because those facts just don't show up at that level of description. They only show up when you make some kind of a posteriori identification between those states that you discriminated and phenomenal consciousness. Sure, if you say, okay, I've made this distinction here, at the functional level or the representation level or whatever, and yeah, and it's really clear, and there's one scenario and there's another scenario, fine. And then you say, well, but where is the phenomenal consciousness? Well, then you've got to make some sort of hypothesis as to where it goes, and that doesn't.
Yeah, but that's the type A part. So the type A part says do the conceptual analysis first. Conceptual analysis says consciousness requires some kind of higher order awareness. So look for that.
No,
that's the folk psychology thing. I mean, that's the kind of type A project, right? You get all the platitudes and then you ramsify them and you look for the things that do that.
But well, yes, but insofar as you can do that, I think you're now slipping out of the notion of consciousness into one much more like one that I have, as whatever it is that underlies these reports and judgments in the heterophenomenology. Because you cannot do a conceptual analysis on the what it is likeness, because that's the ineffable thing that only, that Louis Armstrong, you've just got to know it, it's just there, and you can't analyze that. And because you're gesturing at a kind of sort of feature of the interface between yourself and the world, which is not articulable by you at all. Now, what you're doing, I think, is a conceptual analysis of whatever it is that provokes my judgments about it. And that's what I call the diet zero shuffle. So you say, I'm going to give you an explanation of qualia, diet qualia, not the really rich stuff, but still the substantive thing. But what you actually give is not you, but physicalist realists generally, is an explanation of our dispositions to make reports about this stuff. And I think that higher order horror theory does a good job of that. But that's the meta problem, not the hard problem.
Yeah, I would say you do I don't know, I don't have a good word for it, but the waltz in the other direction. So you start off by saying, I'm not going to explain consciousness, and then do. But say, no, that's not consciousness. That's something else. And I'm not going to call it consciousness, but clearly what you just explained.
I think what there is here, I think that what's interesting, I'll be really interested to know what people listening to this debate think, because I think there is a position here that we're both pretty happy with. There's like sort of this sort of Venn diagram, and there's an intersection here,
right,
where we're both happy, and we're sort of wandering around our own circles, each of us, and occasionally we get in that area where it intersects, and then we sort of wander off a bit into the other part of the circle, and then we think, what the hell is this guy saying? And it's really interesting. It'd be really good to try to somehow sharpen this up and see if we could articulate very, very clearly what we agree on, very, very clearly. We've been trying to do it here, but this is just,
informal.
Very informal. But if we could really sharpen up what we agree on, and then see what's left, that would be really, really interesting. Because I think
it's time for a workshop on these kind of ideas. It would be good to do that, I think.
Because I think we've both got you've got a good Keith and a bad Keith, and I've got a good reason.
Exactly. No, and I think these are the important questions. Like getting clear on this, it would make a lot of other stuff more tractable, right?
I agree completely. Agree.
Yeah. Okay. I hate to cut this off because I have about 1,000 other things I want to ask you about, but I do have to kind of start wrapping things up. So I wonder if there's anything which hasn't come up, which you would like to have come up.
Well, I could, energy reserves permitting, I could keep going all day. But I think we've thrashed out some of the big differences and similarities. So no, I'm okay. I mean, what about you? Is there anything that you want?
There's a lot, but I don't have the the time. But I think we'll have to do another round of this. I think in general, your work is excellent. I admire what you're doing. I take a lot of. I've read a lot of your stuff, and I think that it's the best kind of philosophy in the sense that it's clear, it's passionate, you're defending something, you're challenging things. So I think you're doing wonderful work, and I really appreciate your willingness to share and to come on and to engage with people who disagree with you in a very constructive way. And that's not something that philosophers are known for, but they should be. And I think you're setting an example for how we could come to be known for that.
No,
so I want to thank you for that.
Totally reciprocated.
Thank you. All right. Well, so stay on for the line for just a second. I'll say bye offline. But thanks again for joining me, Keith, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks a lot.